A special presentation from American Experience and Frontline. Major funding for God in America is provided by
the Pew Charitable Trusts, driven by the power of knowledge to improve public policy, inform the public, and stimulate civic life.
The Fetzer Institute, harnessing the power of love, forgiveness, and compassion in our global community. Online at fetzer.org.
With additional funding from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, dedicated to strengthening America's future through education. Exclusive corporate funding for American Experience is provided by Liberty Mutual.
The best way to fully understand this nation's history is through the eyes of those who experienced it. Liberty Mutual, proud sponsor of American Experience.
Major funding for American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit. Major funding for Frontline is provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. With additional funding from the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness. American Experience, Frontline, and God in America are also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Okay, you've created this nation. What's the story? What's the story of this nation? What does it mean to be an American? Suddenly, you have both the opportunity but also the imperative to construct something of an identity.
For Thomas Jefferson, the new republic must be founded with religious freedom, and that, he believed, was a God-given right.
One thing he says is, God created us in such a way that we can make our religious choices. Who is the state to tell us something that God chose not to tell us?
It was not just a matter of principle. He had already witnessed the struggle for religious freedom with his own eyes. And his remarkable partnership with the Baptists in his home state of Virginia would help define what freedom would mean for America. In 1773, 27-year-old Jeremiah Moore, a Baptist from Fairfax County, Virginia, found himself arrested and thrown in jail. His crime? Preaching without a license.
Oh, I have felt the effects of an ecclesiastical establishment. And have been told by the judge in his seat, you shall lie in jail until you rot. For my crime was no other than preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Virginia's Baptists were evangelical Christians who came from Pennsylvania, migrating south to the Piedmont Hills of central Virginia, looking to spread their gospel message.
They were looking for converts and were bringing to people the idea that people can encounter God and can encounter and experience God for themselves. In fact, not only can, but must.
Baptists called it rebirth, and it meant choosing Christ as your personal Savior. and being baptized as an adult.
You had to testify persuasively to that dramatic conversion, and then you would be taken to this river and immersed, sometimes in quite cold water, and there would be crowds. Crowds weren't just sort of politely observing this ritual, they were also sometimes being slain in the spirit and falling down, laughing, shrieking, praying.
The experience began to attract hundreds of converts in rural Virginia.
They're singing and they're preaching the terrors of hell and the glories of the gospel of Christ. Everybody's praying for them and they're crying and if you are moved somehow, these people will embrace you, they will love you, they will support you. And the next day, you're telling your neighbor, and you're inviting your neighbor to the next meeting. And it goes like that.
But to convert to a different religion was dangerous in colonial Virginia. America's oldest and most prosperous colony was run by a powerful ruling class. And at its heart was its religion, the Anglican Church.
Everyone was an Anglican. I mean, everyone was part of an Anglican parish. By definition, you were a parishioner in an Anglican parish.
Citizens paid taxes to maintain their parish church and their minister.
And everyone in Virginia society understood that when you left your house and saw that society was functioning, you were encountering the work of the church, the established church, and you were also encountering the work of these elites who were overseeing that work.
For more than a century, Virginia's elite had held power along with the Anglican Church. Now the Baptists were drawing converts away from Anglican parishes.
To share the gospel with you is to call you into a whole new way of being. And of course, that's not particularly appealing if you're a happy elite person who likes your way of being as it is, just fine, thank you, everything's hunky-dory. It's quite appealing if you're a person who lives a life of toil and suffering, and you would, of course, be compelled by a message that says, come into this new religious society, into this new community.
There was a sense that religion was a big factor in what would hold a society together. And the Baptists, as a growing, gathering force, were seen as a significant threat.
The colony responded by restricting where non-Anglicans could preach. Any preacher without a license could be arrested.
This was very burdensome, and it offended their sense of what was right because they believed that they should obey God and not man. They needed no man's permission in order to go somewhere and proclaim the gospel.
Jeremiah Moore was one of many Baptists who'd refused to get a license and had been thrown in jail.
God himself is the only one to whom man is accountable for his religious sentiments simply. Nor has he erected any tribunal on earth qualified to judge whether the man worships in an acceptable manner or not.
When you start getting preachers like Jeremiah Moore and John Waller and Samuel Harris getting arrested and tried and thrown into prison, either they knew or they found out right away that the more trouble they got in with the government, the more appealing they were to the rank and file out there on the Piedmont. They said, well, at least these people are convinced. At least these people are committed to what they believe. They're willing to put it on the line. They're willing to risk.
Moore turned his incarceration to his advantage, preaching to crowds through the bars of his cell.
God is our refuge. God is our strength. And the righteous God is...
He's not just preaching to the converted. He's making news.
Those of you who are thus with imprisonment defame.
And so the government comes down harder. All of a sudden, in almost every county, militiamen are arresting these folks, sending them to jail, and it spreads all the way across the Commonwealth.
But all this backfired because actually being persecuted and being willing to go to jail, this gave great credibility rather than discredit them. It empowered them.
In October 1776, Jeremiah Moore brought a petition to the Virginia Assembly demanding the right for Baptists to be free to worship without fear of persecution.
Equal liberty, that invaluable blessing, which, though it be the birthright of every good member of the state, is what your petitioners have been deprived of.
10,000 names were on the petition.
And they were looking for an advocate. An advocate to go into the courts and at least make their case.
They found their advocate in Thomas Jefferson. As a member of the Virginia Assembly, he'd received the Baptists' petition. Weeks before, he'd drafted America's Declaration of Independence. And what he would now undertake on behalf of the Baptists would enshrine religious liberty as an American value.
This one is obvious to him. This one is very obvious to him. Suddenly, in his backyard, is an example of the worst kind of abuse that government can do.
We tend to think of Jefferson as a sort of anti-religious person, but he was intensely religious, or as we might say now, he was spiritual but not religious. But he thought that it was up to the individuals. And he didn't want the state to tell him what to think. We think of Jefferson as a rationalist, but in some way this is also an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation, where the Protestants are saying every individual is free to read the Bible for himself and figure out what it says. Jefferson wanted us to do that too. He wanted us to be free to look at the evidence in the world of religion and decide what we thought it all meant.
Jefferson's own religion had nothing in common with Baptist beliefs. He created his own version of the Gospels, keeping only what he believed relevant, cutting out the rest.
And he takes away all the narrative, all the miracles, all of that stuff that just won't stand rational inspection. No, Jesus didn't raise Lazarus because there is no exemption to death. But Jesus says, blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. This is divine wisdom. And no institution can mediate it for you, including a church, let alone a government.
I cannot give up my guidance to the magistrate because he knows no more of the way to heaven than I do and is less concerned to direct me right than I am to go right.
Jefferson met with Virginia's leading Baptists, who told him of their struggle to practice their faith.
Jefferson said, I couldn't disagree with you more about the substance of all of this, but I will defend your right to say it. And that's exactly what he does.
Jefferson joined forces with the Baptists.
And their idea, which is radical at the time, is you disestablish the church. You allow every religious sect and denomination to compete in the marketplace of ideas.
Jefferson began to draft a bill that would end state-supported religion.
No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever.
Ministers are not going to grow fat and lazy relying on a check from the state. Rather, they're going to become diligent.
Jefferson went further. Individuals must be free to worship as they choose.
All men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion.
It's through this competition of religious sects and denominations that the purest and the most efficacious faith in church will prevail in Virginia.
But when Jefferson submitted his bill to the Virginia Assembly, it was met with fierce opposition by many Virginians, including his fellow revolutionary, Patrick Henry.
It tells us something about precisely how radical and revolutionary this idea is, that even these revolutionary Virginians suddenly, when actually faced with the possibility of religious freedom, there was a sort of collective sense of needing to pause and slow things down a bit.
Henry feared that without state support, religion in Virginia would wither and die. At war's end, he drafted a bill that would fund not just the Anglican Church, but other approved denominations. When the Baptists read Henry's proposed bill, they were outraged.
This is still state control or state funding or state monitoring of religious institutions, and we want hands off.
Baptist support for Jefferson's vision of a religiously free Virginia grew more vocal. Their message struck a chord with ordinary Virginians who had fought for America's independence. In January 1786, Jefferson's bill was finally passed.
That connection was so palpable between the tyranny of a government that didn't allow you to do your own thing and the tyranny of religious groups that wouldn't allow you to do your own thing, that we decided that, yes, it was worth the risk, that we need to try.
And when a year later, the Constitution was being drafted in Philadelphia, Jefferson and the Baptists hoped that their hard-fought principle of separating church from state would be part of the country's founding document. But when the Constitution was presented in September 1787, in not one of the 7 articles was there any guarantee of religious liberty or other individual rights.
People were incensed. Here was a constitution that created a very powerful central government. Surely individual rights ought to be protected, ought to be specified. That was the concern.
The Constitution's framers wanted to create a more perfect union, and some feared that statements on religion would be divisive. But Jefferson believed their fears were unfounded, that defending an individual's liberties through a Bill of Rights would hold the country together.
Jefferson says, let's do this experiment. Let's see what happens. But I think he had a real faith, we might say, in the power of freedom of conscience. And he believed that we could be held together through other sorts of things other than a shared religion. And those would be shared values around things like democracy and things like freedom.
Virginia and 4 other states agreed with Jefferson and demanded a guarantee of individual rights. On September 25, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York, America's first Congress proposed a Bill of Rights. The First Amendment was ratified and became part of the Constitution in 1791.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Years later, as president, Thomas Jefferson would define the First Amendment as having erected a wall of separation between church and state.
The metaphor is so strong that people often think that, oh, the First Amendment means that there should be a wall of separation of church and state. It doesn't mean that at all. You know, it says that we are not going to establish laws that are going to favor one religion or over another. But it doesn't say exactly what kind of barrier there's going to be.
Like the new nation, the First Amendment would be a work in progress. But with no national church, religion would not be guaranteed a place at the center of public life. No other nation had ever taken such a step.
I think there's some fear in the word experiment that you hear a lot in the early America. You know, there is fear there. There is this idea that it could go wrong, that it can fail, the experiment can fail. And there's a lot of talk, especially around the issue of religious freedom, that this is maybe too dangerous.
With the American religious marketplace opening up, everybody realizes that one choice could be none of the above. You can choose not to go to church, not to read the Bible,